Let's dive into our review for exam 3. Like the previous exams, it's going to be 40 multiple choice questions. 10 of the questions are ones that I've written myself. The 30 remaining questions are all from the test banks that you've been using on your quizzes. I think you're going to find I'm going to be pretty clear on this test review. So if you study the things I tell you to study, you should be in good shape. Uh, we started with the fact that in small to medium-sized businesses, typically the owners are also the managers, and that does not lead to agency issues. At some point, sometimes owners begin to step out of the managerial control, and that's where an agency relationship comes in. You're going to be responsible for knowing how it's typically done in small to medium-sized businesses, and then the basic definition of an agency relationship. Remember that the key, there's not a specific test question about this, but this will help you answer the test questions, that it's always about trying to ensure that the interests are aligned. No questions on that. So again, not a specific question, but typically the things that we talk about are monitoring and compensation. Something that we are going to talk about, a typical or a specific exam question, is what is the function of the board of directors? Specifically, remember that they are owners, that they are the shareholders, single entity that is tasked with monitoring the management. This talks about the tasks of the board of directors. And then there's a fair number of questions on the exam from this and the leadership chapter about CEO duality. Remember that the basic definition of duality is when the CEO is both the chairman of the board or the chairwoman of the board, as could be appropriate, and the CEO of the company. One of the things that we talked about was CEO compensation. Make sure that you read the section in the chapter about this, both in terms of who decides the compensation for one, and also the proper way to do stock options is another specific question. Note that when internal controls fail, there are external controls in corporate governance. And so these are the sorts of things that constitute external control. And there's a test question on that. No specific test question on any of these. Which stakeholders privileged? Remember, in the US system, it is the shareholder. In other words, the people who own the stock. Keep in mind, in other countries, you see other stakeholders that are more privileged or more privileged than they are in the US system. In the US system, it is the shareholder. Also, keep in mind this idea of stewardship theory, which says that we can hire CEOs to do a good job, and we can, to a certain extent, trust them because they want to do a good job. Not because again, it will help you with some of the test questions, but it's just important for me that you understand I'm personally a believer in stewardship theory. I believe in the alignment of interests, and I believe in incentive packages and the compensation, although a lot of those things don't test out as making much of a difference, which is why I come back to stewardship theory. And those are the questions from chapter 10. On to chapter 11. If you remember, I talked about there are 3 principles that you should look to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of each of the organizational forms: accountability and responsibility, communication or the sharing of information, and cost. And that is an exam question. Remember that typically organizations tend to develop in this form. Functional structures work well sometimes in big companies as they develop more diversified product lines. They're going to want to go to a multi-divisional structure. Again, there is a question along those lines. Nothing about, per se, the simple structure, I don't think. Functional structure, remember in all the forms, I want you to understand the pros and the cons. In the functional structure, the pros it tends to be the lowest cost organization. So in that sense, it aligns well with the cost leadership strategy. It develops clear accountability only in the sense that if you have an engineering question, you know who to talk to. And it allows the development of deep expertise in functions because you're organized by functions. The primary weaknesses is the communication across functions tend to be particularly poor, and ultimately only the person at the top has P&L responsibility, and that can be a problem. Then we go into the multidivisional forms, and there are a couple of multidivisional forms. The most similar, if you will, to the functional form is the cooperative form, where we create product divisions, but we still have a relatively strong corporate headquarters. And this corporate headquarters is in charge of integrating the various knowledge streams. So the cooperative form has a lot of integration mechanisms in that's intended to improve the sharing across the divisions. In terms of the cons, it does increase the cost somewhat typically, and it still does not establish clear accountability below the level of the president because nobody controls the assets. Because of that, the next form is the SBU, or Strategic Business Unit form. Now, the pro of this is it establishes clear accountability. Typically, the division manager has financial P&L responsibility and therefore can be managed by financial controls. They use strategic controls within the different parts below the general manager of the SBU. It sometimes makes sharing more difficult across the divisions, and typically cost is higher. And then you get to a specific type of the divisional called the competitive. This is typically used in unrelated diversification. This can be a fairly low cost model simply because all of these divisions have strict financial accountability for what they're doing. So the divisions are very important or very independent. They do not share information, but the strength is all of these division chiefs know they are responsible for the performance of their division. And if they don't meet the expectations, they're going to be unemployed. Relatively lean corporate staff whose primary job is allocating capital and hiring and firing the division CEOs. The matrix is what I call the Goldilocks approach. Keep in mind that you can have functions on top, and I think in a lot of cases that's the most common, where they do projects down the side, but you could have a divisional form where you had, for example, geographic divisions, and then you had functional integration teams. So the big thing here is that from a pro standpoint, it tries to get over this idea of communications flow. So this should be the best at communications flow, while still picking up whatever attribute of the primary form that the company chooses. The cons: more than one boss, typically more costly, and it tends to blur the lines of accountability. And then if you remember, that got into my discussion and the video we watched in class with Ann Mulcahy. Now, there is a specific question towards the end of the clip that we watched where she talks about what she did at Xerox about organizational forms. There is a specific question on that. I made a big deal of that where we talked about what did she say was perfect for Xerox or what wasn't perfect, but it was important that she'd made a decision. Make sure you look over your notes and understand what that was. If you don't remember your notes, then you can click on the link and rewatch the video. Again, it's toward the end. And that is it for Chapter 11. We're on to Chapter 12 for leadership. As much as I love this formulation, I did not put a test question in on it, surprising to me, even me, in part because I didn't want to go against what the textbook has for their wiring diagram. Instead, I chose to dive into some of the other topics. There is a specific text question on latitude and discretion, and it goes into organization. What is it about an organization that would tend to increase or decrease a senior manager's latitude or discretion? So be aware of that. No specific test questions here. Nothing on the organizational structure. I do talk about, there is a test question about human and social capital. Make sure that you know the definitions of both human and social capital and that you can apply them. A couple of questions about organizational culture. Specifically, what does it take to change an organizational culture, and an ethical culture. So we talked about how new companies are blank slates and that founders really get the best chance to set their culture. If a strong culture, which can be good or bad, remember, strong doesn't imply whether it's effective, it just says it's deeply entrenched. It's really hard to change that unless there's a great need for change. Nothing specific on Amazon. Here we talked about how to make changes. The specific test question is about what type of leader is most likely to be effective in changing a culture. And so you're going to want to be familiar with strong and weak cultures, how cultures are set, and those sorts of things, because you're going to have an application question. Likewise, there is a question about the ethical culture that again goes into how do you instill and maintain an ethical culture. There is a question about the Boeing example. And so if you don't remember anything about the Boeing example, go back and check your notes because this is one that you should get right if you were in class and you took any notes on the Boeing situation. One question on the balanced scorecard. Remember that financial measures tend to be easy to measure, which is why people like them, but they also tend to be rearward looking. In other words, this is the performance that we've got because we had done these things in the past that are harder to measure. So that is an important distinction, and you're going to want to be familiar with the balanced scorecard. Top management team, I had to go over this very quickly in class. Make sure you understand the textbook's reading on heterogeneous versus homogeneous, and what are the strengths and weaknesses, and what are the conditions in which a heterogeneous versus a homogeneous top management team and board are likely to be valued. Likewise, CEO succession. We had just a few minutes to talk about this. Know when an insider is going to be preferred, and know when an outsider is going to be preferred, because there's a couple of test questions relating to that issue. There's also a question on CEO duality out of this chapter. It's important just to know what it is, and I've already talked about that earlier, and also the concept of stewardship theory and whether a person believes much in stewardship theory, what their choices are likely to lead them to want in terms of a top management team. Okay, one more chapter to go. And rounding out the exam is the chapter on strategic entrepreneurship. Make sure you're familiar with this term creative destruction. Even though we always tend to talk about entrepreneurship in this very positive light, the reality is, in most cases, when a new product comes out, it displaces somebody that's already in the market trying to do something similar to that. And you'll be, not that there's a specific question about it, but you'll remember, if you remember my discussion about Garmin, and the pros and the cons, the pluses and the minuses, the positives and the bads that Garmin's experienced, you'll understand creative destruction. This is an important slide that there is definitely a question off of, which is why big companies should be good at strategic entrepreneurship, but then again, why it is hard to be successful. Also, make sure you can answer this question: which of the above types of innovation do big companies do well? And make sure you understand what the various types of innovations are. No particular questions off of that slide. There's two questions off of this slide. Know the difference between autonomous and top-down, or I think the textbook term for that is induced strategic behavior. And you're going to need to know the pros and cons of each approach. There is a specific question off of this slide, so make sure you understand these things. There also is a question about these sorts of issues. When do companies tend to acquire smaller companies? What are they typically looking for? Both what's the big company looking for and what's the small company looking for? Also in cooperative alliances, talking about innovation through cooperative alliances. So make sure you go back and reread this part of the chapter. And there's one other question. Let me look real quick. Going back to this, not only is this how teams do innovation better, but be familiar with the concept of product champions and these principles about how product champions succeed. And I will cover that product champions a lot in the class. I'm making this before we actually have the class, so I'll make sure I go through that in detail. Again, if you go through this video and you point to the areas, I guarantee you've looked at 100, you'll have been covered 100% of the questions on the exam. And also, if you've followed my advice and you've been taking the practice quizzes twice, you've probably seen half of the exam just by virtue of the fact that you've seen a good chunk of the test bank. So you should be in good shape if you've taken the 2 quizzes and you watch this video and dive into the areas I've told you to make sure you understand. Good luck.